And welcome again to everyone who is joining us this evening, community members, UW faculty, staff, students, administrators, alumni. Thank you for joining us both in person and via live stream this evening. We're so thrilled to be hosting this Louder Than Words series here at the Othello UW Commons. And for those of you who are not as familiar, the UW Othello Commons is both a physical space as well as a place-based initiative that's really working to build on the UW's long-standing engagement with and commitment to the greater Southeast Seattle communities. And the Commons opened its doors back in January of 2019 to serve as both a learning and a collaboration space for community partners, UW faculty, staff, and students. And our whole vision for the Othello UW Commons is that the UW is a valuable present and long-term partner in advancing equity in issues of education, health, and opportunities here in South Seattle. And therefore, the Commons was really to help actualize that vision. The Commons was really intentionally designed to serve as this catalyst, this learning space, this convening tool, this entry point for collaboration between the community and the UW here in South Seattle. So as we continue to work on recovering from the pandemic, during which we had to close this facility, we're just so thrilled to be able to help reactivate this space with the Louder Than Words series, which is being organized by both the UW Offices of External Affairs and Undergraduate Academic Affairs. I also wanted to acknowledge that tonight's live streaming is made possible by the UW's Academic and Student Affairs Advancement. So I'd now like to introduce UW's Director of Regional and Community Relations, Sally Clark, who will tell us a little bit more about this series. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Come on, there we go. And thank you, Fran, for introducing and getting us going tonight. My name is Sally Clark. I work for the university in Regional and Community Relations. Perhaps more importantly to me for this fantastic space, I live near the Othello Commons, and I'm so excited that we are in here after a year and a half of not being able to be in here and to be in the Othello community and to have all of you here and to have the space lit up at night and to have there be community action here at night and to have our guests here. And my job is actually to introduce them, which I promise I will do. When we were trying to figure out what role Ed Taylor and I wanted to play in activating the space coming out of COVID, we had a bunch of ideas, and maybe you will be invited to a Waffle Wednesdays someday. But the one that we have going here is now a second Wednesdays of every month during the academic conversation. And it is very clear to all of us, I think, that there are zillions of things that are pulling us apart from each other. There are zillions of things that are dividing us in this world. And there are a lot of people out there who are doing amazing things to figure out what's the path forward together. And so this series, Louder Than Words, is about choosing some of those areas, choosing some of those things that we know are difficult topics. They're things, again, that are pulling us apart, and finding people in our community who we want to have conversations with about, what are you doing that's different? What are you doing that you're trying? What are you doing that's helping to pull people together or to set a new story and a new path forward? So it is my pleasure to introduce our guests tonight along that line. To my immediate left here, we have Carver Gayton. Carver Gayton has deep roots in Seattle, where he was born and raised, and he has deep roots with the University of Washington, we're proud to say. Gayton earned his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees from the UW, where he also played football and served as an assistant coach in the football program. He's taught at the high school and college level, given direction to Boeing's interaction with colleges and universities, was an FBI special agent, served in state government, and was the founding executive director of the Northwest African American Museum. He's also an author and published historian and has served on a wide range of national, state, and local boards, including the UW Alumni Association. He's also been inducted into the Husky Athletics Hall of Fame 2 times. To the next left, we have LaNesha DeBardelaben. LaNesha's passion is to drive success with Black museums. She specializes in organizational leadership and management, institutional programming, and strategic engagement. Prior to joining the Northwest African American Museum, LaNesha was the senior vice president at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. With 3 master's degrees, respectively, in museum studies, history, and library science, LaNesha is currently pursuing a PhD and serves as the national president of the Association of African American Museums Board of Directors. She has global experience with museums and libraries in Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, England, Germany, and Israel, and is involved in both the International Council of Museums and the International Women's Forum. And then finally, my colleague, my partner in crime in figuring out how to activate and make this series happen, Ed Taylor is Vice Provost and Dean of Undergraduate Academic Affairs at the University of Washington, where he oversees educational academic experience. He's a professor in the College of Education, where his research interests include the moral dimensions of education, leadership in education, and social justice. His PhD is from the University of Washington. And with that, I'm excited for us to get into tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. This is meant to be a conversation between us. It's meant to be somewhat informal, a fireside chat of sorts. I have a question for you in a second, Carver, but I want to turn to LaNesha. We're here in part because of an effort you put together that you've been working on for at least the last year to commemorate Martin Luther King's visit to Seattle 60 years ago. And I want to spend some time talking about that. And there's a reason Carver's sitting next to you. We'd invited Lenny Wilkins to join us, and Lenny couldn't join us this evening. I'm turning to you at this moment because I invited you to sit next to Carver, and about 3 hours ago, I sent you an email, but a few hours ago, and said, LaNesha, would you mind taking a seat and engaging this conversation with Carver? And you said yes, and I just want to thank you for that. So please give LaNesha.
Thank you.
Now, before I start asking you both questions, we had a moment just about a half an hour ago to sit together and just to catch up. When you walked into the restaurant, Carver looked at you and said, "My angel," and you looked at Carver and said, "My savior." What is that? Because I'm nobody's angel or savior. Why did you greet each other that way? What did that mean?
Well, Ed, let me say, it's the opposite. So Carver is my angel. And he referred to me tonight as his savior because he did not want to be sitting on this stage by himself tonight talking for an hour with this wonderful audience. But let me just say that I did not just say yes, I said absolutely, I will be there. Because anytime I have an opportunity to just sit next to Carver and to engage in any activity with him, my soul is fed, my spirit is inspired. I am so grateful for truly the role of angel that Carver has been to me in my 4 years here in Seattle. Carver is the founding director of the Northwest African American Museum, where I currently serve, and he laid a solid foundation for the rest of us to follow and build upon. And so he has been one of my most ardent supporters in my leadership here, and I know that whenever I call upon Carver, he is supporting, he is believing in NAM and in our future and in what we're striving to do, and he is actively supporting, he and his wife Carmen. So they are our angels at NAM.
Being an angel is a lot to live up to, Carver. You thought those Hall of Fame inductions were a big deal, but wow, the ticket into heaven, that's special. Carver, the Hall of Fame induction, 2 Hall of Fame inductions were mentioned. This isn't a conversation about football, but I do want to mention this because in '94 you were inducted as part of a 1960s team that was, the entire team was inducted into the Husky Hall of Fame. And then most recently, just a couple of weeks ago, you and colleagues, Greg Alex, a friend, Ralph Bayard, Harvey Blanks, Lamar Mills, were all inducted into the Husky Hall of Fame. And you were inducted this time for what you stood up for. How does it feel to be forever memorialized in Husky athletics? And in this case, for standing up for something. Say something about your induction recently.
I appreciate that. I'm going to speak to that here in a second, but I just want to, first of all, thank you and Sally for getting this whole, thing together, having the community, to get folks here, having this, over the internet. It's just a wonderful accomplishment, and it's a wonderful ending to some respects in terms of what LaNesha has done over these last few days. it's just been amazing work that she's done to get this whole operation together and celebrating that day back in 1961 when Martin Luther King came here, and I had a part in that I was there. I saw him and talked to him. But and I just want to say one more thing about LaNesha. Even though I was the founder of the Northwest African American Museum, you know, she has come in here from Detroit and has taken the museum to another level. And it's just amazing what she's done. And an example of her approach is what's been happening over these last few days. I don't know, I'm so surprised, you know, to see her, because she's been up, you know, day and night practically getting this whole program together. And this is the, you know, the ending of that whole process, but it's extremely, you know, historical. And this city, the museum, is lucky to have someone of her stature here running the Northwest African American Museum. So I had to say that. Now, with regard to your question, you wanted to know how it felt to be inducted into the Hall of Fame the second time. I'll tell you one thing. That experience that we had back in 1969 was something that lives with you for your entire life. That's many, many years ago. The thing about the recognition is the fact that people can remember that long ago and have the determination, you know, to recognize what those young men did back in 1969 and standing up to you know, Coach Owens, probably the most powerful man in the state of Washington at that time. And I'm just fortunate to be able to be part of that group of young men who spoke truth to power when it came to the coach. The coach wanted them to swear allegiance, you know, to him and to the mascot, to the university, to the Board of Regents, and they had some things to say. There are 70 folks on that team, 70 ball players on that team, and there are 4 individual ball players who the coach pointed out that we were going to take them off the team because they did not buy in on this allegiance to the university. It kind of reminded me of some of you are too young to remember the McCarthy era, where you make these pledges. You were going to swear an oath. But these young men, as I said, spoke truth to power, and they said that we have an opinion. We have a right to be able to express what we feel as though what's been going on within this program. And they said what they thought the coach wanted them to say, to speak truth to what was going on. But what happened, and there's only 10 blacks on the team altogether, and they chose 4 of those students, 4 of those ball players to kick off the team. And it was wrong. And I felt as though it was my position, you know, as the coach that was brought up to Seattle, to the Huskies, and to speak on behalf of the ball players and to be able to have a communication line between myself and the coaching staff. And that was undermined by the coach, you know, at that time. And so when I found out that they were fired, you know, from the team, there was no question in my mind the position I was going to take, you know, with regard to that. I was going to stand by those young ball players. And the thing about it was that each one of those young men were outstanding in their own right. They were outstanding students. They were not outspoken in terms of what was going on a day-to-day basis with regard to what was taking place on the team, but chose those 4 ball players to kick off the team. The coach expected me at that point to either stand up with him or to stand up with the ball players. it was my choice to stand up for the ball players. He asked me to, begged me to come back or to stay on the coaching staff. That happened from him as well as the athletic director to say that he expressed the same thing. You want you to stay. I know you're thinking about leaving and so on and so forth. I said, hey, the communication gap has been broken. The communication gap is there. I cannot breach it. And I'm resigning from the team. And so I thought it was an important position I've taken. We had death threats from throughout the entire country. But the important thing, I think, to remember with regard to these young men, every one of them are outstanding in their field today. We have an attorney who's a well-known, exceptional attorney here in town. We have a fellow who is a really fine ball player, but an exceptional actor, is on Broadway and is known throughout the country for what he has done. We have a fellow who is helping out folks who are having drug problems and is finishing up his doctorate degree. Every one of those young men have moved on to this next level. It reminds me of what a well-known figure, I'll mention his name in a second, what he said to me: when anybody disrespects you as a human being. And what he said to me, when someone does something like that, is that you have to say, not one drop of my self-worth relates to the expectation that you have of me. That goes to anybody who tries to disrespect you as a human being. Not one drop of my self-worth is dependent on how you see me. They had that within themselves, and that's something that they kept in their hearts over the years, and there's successful young men making great contributions. And that's what it's all about. If you're going to be an educator or coach, is to have that kind of a result, even though every effort was made was to subjugate those young men.
So that's a leadership story in part, Carver, for which you've been recognized and honored. I want to transition to leadership for you, because we made reference to the events of the last few days. I want to talk a little bit about the events of the last few days, but I want you to speak about the leadership that you showed, because I know you're not going to personalize this, so I want to make this question about you. You managed to bring a community together to commemorate 60 years ago that Martin Luther King came to Seattle. So I want to talk about the leadership, how you managed to bring together the coalition of people that pulled off this set of events, CEO and president of the museum. A little bit about what happened these last 3 days and about how you led that effort.
Thank you, Ed, for that question. And I must say that the University of Washington was the first partner at the table when the Northwest African American Museum considered our role as the keepers of culture, as the gathering space for community. And in the midst of a pandemic, we knew that we've been away from one another far too long. And the 60th anniversary of Dr. King's visit was an ideal opportunity to reconvene and regather community in a meaningful way. And being in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. County, Washington, and I'm so delighted to see our county councilman here, Girme Zahele. Hello there, councilman. We knew that it was absolutely essential that we mark these 60 years in a meaningful way. And we knew that we could not and should not and would not do it alone as a single institution. And so we approached the University of Washington as the initial partner. Our scholar in resident at NAM is one of your faculty members. Dr. Relina Joseph is our scholar in resident. And so we have had a very strong relationship with the University of Washington. And from that conversation, we began to identify organizations, community leaders in the community who we needed to help us build a very meaningful, a very significant, and a very special moment for our community to reset ourselves, to recommit ourselves to the ideals of Dr. King. And so we first identified the sites, the institutions that Dr. King attended and spoke at when he was here in 1961. So we reached out to Mount Zion Baptist Church because they were the institution that had the original vision to invite Dr. King here under the visionary leadership of their pastor, Reverend Dr. Samuel B. McKinney, who came to Seattle in 1958, having attended Morehouse College with Dr. King and pledged Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity with Dr. King and grew up literally with Dr. King. They were both sons of Baptist pastors. And so they had a lifelong relationship. And Reverend Dr. McKinney and the Mount Zion's Brotherhood Committee reached out to Dr. King and brought him here. So we knew we needed Mount Zion at the table. And then we knew that we needed all the other locations that hosted Dr. King during that original 1961 visit. Temple de Hirsch, Sinai, Synagogue. We knew that we needed Garfield High School at the table. We knew that we needed Plymouth Church at the table. We knew that we needed Eagles Auditorium, which is now ACT Theater. We knew that we needed the hotel that lodged Dr. King, Fairmont Olympic Hotel. And so we identified those key institutions to be essential components of this three-day commemoration, and then we identified broader partners. And we ended up with a 40-person community-wide planning committee that spent several months collaborating and cooperating with one another to organize this extensive three-day commemoration. Then we also reached out to corporate partners as well as labor unions, government entities, and other organizations to serve as sponsors. And there were 25 sponsors that said, yes, we believe in this moment for our community to come together to remember and renew our commitment. And so it began with vision, a conversation, and it extended to into just a beautiful three-day commemoration that we're now looking back upon, celebrating our achievements. So over 3 days, we walked the path that Dr. King walked when he was here. We started at Garfield High School on Saturday for the opening ceremony, and we vaccinated 50 individuals in partnership with Public Health Seattle King County. We distributed hundreds of children's books, including the one by Martin Luther King III called My Daddy, to children so that they can see themselves, know themselves, love themselves. We then went from our opening day at Garfield, where Dr. King spoke, to the parking lot of Mount Zion Church on Sunday, where we gathered clergy, because Dr. King was first and foremost a Baptist pastor, the son, the grandson, and the great-grandson of Black Baptist ministers. And so we gathered the clergy, and we prayed for our regional community, and we sang songs of the civil rights movement. And then on Monday, we gathered at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel for a press conference and coffee hour, and it concluded on Monday evening at the University of Washington, where Dr. King spoke. And so the vision required many hands, many minds, many hearts, and they all came to the table together to work collaboratively. And I believe that we are a better community because of the way that we came together to mark this moment.
So I want you both to provide some context here. And Carver, I'm looking at you, but LaNesha, but you've learned a lot about this last few days about Seattle in 1960. So put us in 1960, Garfield High School. You've graduated from the University of Washington. You've returned to Garfield as a teacher in 1960. You're one of a handful of Black teachers, maybe 3. And so for those who don't know Garfield, a little bit about the meaning of Garfield High School in Seattle. Not everybody will know that. And Carver, I want you to put us in a room, because Sally Clark and I were talking. I don't know that we know anybody who was in the room that day that King spoke. There are people who say they were in the room, but you're the only one that we actually know who was in it. So as far as anybody knows, I was in the room. But you were in the room the day he spoke. Give us some context for the meaning of Garfield High School. And to invite King was a controversial thing to do at that time. So give us some context for how he gets to Garfield and what your role is at Garfield. And then I'm going to ask you to talk about what it meant to be in the room with him, what you heard and what you learned.
Yeah, 1961. The context, I think, of Martin Luther King coming to Seattle at that time, people's memories, don't make the connection between what we remember about him at the time he passed away and what the situation was and how he was viewed back in 1961. He came into a hostile environment into Seattle at that time, and Reverend McKinney asked him to come up and speak. There were several churches who were asked to have him speak at those churches, and they refused. There was not a political entity, the city council or the mayor or the county council, that asked him, to speak, at that time. So there was real concern. There are those who said he's a rabble-rouser. We really don't want him to be here and do the kinds of things that he did back in Montgomery or in Birmingham or whatever. So we have some trepidation in relation to it. But I have to hand it to folks, obviously, Reverend McKinney. And then the principal at that time at Garfield was Frank Hannawald. He stood up and said that I want Martin Luther King here. He was asked by Reverend McKinney to have him speak there, and he didn't have any hesitation whatsoever. In relation to my role, I had just finished up at the University of Washington, as you indicated. I'd finished up in 1960 with my degree. I did some graduate work, and I was a graduate assistant coach on the football team. And so it was kind of a natural thing for me, since I was involved in education, to want to come back to my alma mater. I had a little bit of trepidation because there were so many teachers there that I had that I was concerned about what they were going to say, about me coming in there. But practically every one of them, and when I graduated from high school, they were still there. So I was asked to come and teach English literature at Garfield, and ultimately to move on into teaching my major of U.S. history. Reverend McKinney got in contact with me and said that he would like me to meet him. Would you be willing to meet him after his presentations at Garfield? And I said, certainly, of course. And what had happened was that there are two assemblies. There was a large population of students there, so the auditorium was not large enough, to hold all the students. So there were two separate assemblies, and I was there at each one of them. I can't remember all the words by any means what he said, and it's too bad that we didn't have a recording, but each one of the speeches were just dynamic. I was just enthralled, never heard a speaker like that, at all. One of the questions comes up is, why did Reverend McKinney, pick me to come back? I think some of it related to the fact I was a young teacher, 22 years old, and he knew our family. In fact, as kind of an aside, on my mother's side of the family, she had a lot of relatives in Cleveland and in Oberlin and that area, and that's where Reverend McKinney grew up, and his father, I think W.H. McKinney, was a well-known preacher there. And my mother had indicated, to me that she knew Reverend McKinney's, Samuel McKinney's father, and he was, I think it was Antioch Baptist Church there. And he was an outstanding orator and so on. So I think that relationship was something that resonated with Reverend McKinney doing and asking me to be there. So I was there for both speeches. really riveted by what he had to say. Came back stage, and you know, I mentioned to you that with the stage that we were speaking at the other day was the same stage where I met him along with Reverend McCain, just the three of us. And I remember that his stature was such that his speech was like coming from a man 10 feet tall. But then I met him, and he was even, my wife gives me a hard time about this, yeah, he was even shorter than me, Carmen. and he put out his hand, and the thing that I remember about him was that in his eyes, there wasn't any small talk or anything of that sort, but he was still in the mode of his speech, because it was about, the theme was the American dream, which was kind of precursor to the speech in 1963 that he gave in Washington, D.C. And he was still in that mode. I mean, he resonated with what he had to say. It was still with him, and I felt that. But I think that we have to, that there may have been a little bit of fear, too, because I think we have to remember that 3 years earlier, we had this, a disturbed woman in New York City, stabbed him in the heart, and near the heart. And he almost died, from that. And the story was, if he had sneezed, the doctor said if he had sneezed, he would have died. There was a little girl that wrote a letter, to him after that. It says, "I'm sure glad, Reverend, that you didn't sneeze." But that kind of thing had to be in his mindset when he came up to speak in Seattle. He didn't know anything about the Northwest, and he obviously was receiving death threats, throughout the country. But for him to come up there and having that determination, that determination along with a touch of that fear, and that is maybe a protective kind of consideration. But what that did with regard to me, because here I am a teacher at Garfield, I decided that, when I was going to start teaching U.S. history that next semester, I was going to make sure that library that my mother had at home with with W.E.B. Du Bois in there, with Frederick Douglass, George Washington Carver, Phyllis Wheatley, the great poetess, with regard to Langston Hughes, the great poet, all those books and those stories there, that I was going to incorporate that into my class. But there was one thing too that it's important to mention, because my mother would read from this book when I could remember from the time I was 4 years old, called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it talked about the real world characters in the story Uncle Tom's Cabin, because people didn't believe all those atrocities that were reflected in the book were real. But she felt as though she had to write this Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. My mother had an original copy of that, came out in 1852, and my great-grandfather's stories in there, Lewis Clark. He was the George Harris, the rebellious mulatto slave in that story, in that book. And so my mother would talk about, she would talk about that. She'd pull that out. But the thing I was concerned about when we heard these stories, we had all these books, but we thought that this is nice, but there's nothing that's being said in the school about, what these outstanding people my mother was talking about, as well as her grandfather. Why wasn't that being talked about in the school? So what's the relevance of it? And what's the relevance of what do you have to say? But anyway, I started, you have these outlines that are given to teachers, what you're supposed to teach. Nothing in there about what you're supposed to say about black folks and the black history. People talking about all these different kinds of terms, quite frankly. And what we're talking about, tell the truth in relation to history in this country, which includes the contributions of black people, the pain that black people have gone through. Tell the truth. That's what we're talking about. Well, what do we need to teach? Well, why should we teach this? Teach the history. Teach the true history of what happened in this country. And I started doing that at Garfield. And one day, the head of the social studies department got in contact with me. Her name was Lola Hart. Some of you may remember that name. You aren't going to remember her father. He was the governor of the state of Washington back in the 1920s. But anyway, she was the head of the social studies department, and she called me into her office. She called me in her office and says, Carver, I just want to let you know that one of your students got in contact with me and said, Carver, Mr. Gayton is selling all of these fairy tales about what black people had done. All of these accomplishments and talking about, slavery, that really, why is he teaching these things that aren't true? This is what the Luella Hart was saying, with regard. And I said, and first of all, she says, I want to let you know, Carver, I want you to continue to do what you've been doing. I want you to continue to do what you're doing. I mean, you're talking 1961. She was an enlightened, and some people want to say woke. She was a woke woman. She, I want you to continue that. And she set up a fellowship for me to take some economics courses. But then I was getting ready, and I said, I was wiping my brow, and I was getting ready to leave. And she says, I want to let you know the young man that told me this, his name was such and such. And that young man was a young black man, young black boy. And that just blew me away. I was not mad at that young man at all. I was mad at the system that made it so that this young man could not accomplish what these outstanding black individuals, black men and women, he didn't think that he could reach those kinds of heights.
It's the title of a book by Carter G. Woodson. Remember the title, LaNesha?
The Miseducation of the Negro.
Miseducation of the Negro. Right. That's exactly what the situation was. So I said, this is something that's really embedded within the entire system that we need to take care of. So I committed from that, even though I did other things. I consider myself, I'd done different jobs and all that sort of thing, but they all relate to education. Education is fundamental, and I committed myself to that. Martin Luther King was the one that triggered it for me.
So, Carver, that's the power of that speech. There's some applause. Go ahead and applause for the power. LaNesha, there's a reflection from Carver, from perhaps the only one that I know that was actually in the room, and the transformation that took place. I'm going to jump ahead in a moment to the March on Washington. LaNesha, as you've been reflecting with the community about that visit, what are some things that you've learned about our community, about those who might have been in the room at the University of Washington? What did you learn as a historian these last few days about our community?
Oh, it has been such a joy to hear from individuals in the community who remember Dr. King being here. I received an email just today en route here from a 15-year-old, she was a 15-year-old student at that time, a high school student who was in the audience when Dr. King spoke at Temple de Hirsch Sinai. And when she saw the Elder Circle video, so the Northwest African American Museum has now created this Elder Circle of elders like Carver Gayton and 7 others who were inducted into this circle of distinction. Individuals who have given their lives in service to others, local African American leaders who we cherish their wisdom, we cherish their sacrifice of love and service to community. And we've created an award for them, we presented that to them, but we also created a video, a tribute video. And someone was watching that on UW's live stream on Monday evening, and that triggered a memory for her. And she said, I remember being in the Temple de Hirsch audience my school took a field trip to hear Dr. King. I was 15 years old, and thank you, NAM. Thank you for helping me to remember the impact that Dr. King's words right here in Seattle had upon my life. And so we've been hearing those kinds of statements of appreciation from community members that this MLK 60 means so much to our community. Now, our community has memorialized Dr. King in so many ways. We have a street named after him. We have a park named after him. We have a church named after him in our community. We have a school named after him. Our county is named after him. And so Dr. King's tenets of life ought to be more real here than anywhere in the United States. I mean, we are reminded of his name in so many places, everywhere we look. Are we living up to that? Are we truly that more beloved community? Dr. King was radical when it came to loving thy neighbor and serving one another. And that's why the MLK 60 theme has been a call to action, inclusion, and empowerment. And we based it on Dr. King's wonderful quote that says the most urgent and pertinent question is, what are you doing for others? We are striving to remind our community of the power of serving others, serving one another. And one thing that was really interesting about Dr. King's life is that when he came here in 1961, his ideas were so radical that some African Americans within, for instance, his denomination, the Baptist Church, refused to support him. And the Baptist denomination split in 1961. And there became a whole new denomination called the Progressive National Baptist Convention that followed Dr. King and other, what they called more radical theologians and spiritual leaders. And the other Baptist congregation, they deemed themselves as the more conservative Black Baptist. And so Dr. King's visit here was a reflection of just the division and the differences in ideology that our entire nation was grappling with at that time. So churches here refused to open their doors to him, and across the country, but he was not deterred or distracted or dismayed by that level of resistance. He was resilient, and he moved forward in spite of the fear and the criticism that was around him. And I think that that's the resilient message of his life for us.
I want to turn, there's so much here, and I want to turn to question and answers because we've got about 15 minutes or so to engage in question and answers. So if you've generated questions, and I know we'll take some from the audience. LaNesha, I want you to put your museum hat on for a second and your president and CEO hat on. I was looking at copies of now August 28, 1963, the March on Washington. 250,000 people are watching, 3,000 members of the press. And as I look at this speech, the actual speech that he had on the podium, that we call the I Have a Dream speech, the speech doesn't say I have a dream. And so I want you to do a little fact checking on this, right? Because the title of the speech is not I Have a Dream. You know the story of Mahalia Jackson. Tell a brief version of how we got to I Have a Dream, because we call it the I Have a Dream speech, but that wasn't the intention of the speech at all.
Not at
Say
all.
something about that.
Absolutely. When Dr. King took to the stage at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, he began by discussing the hypocrisy of American history and of the economic inequity that African Americans had been experiencing, that they had been trying to cash this check that's insufficient for, at that point, a century. This was 100 years after 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. So there was a frustration in his spirit that he brought to that podium, but it was not until Mahalia Jackson, who was a vocalist that sang Dr. King's favorite hymn, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, and whenever Dr. King became discouraged in his leadership, he would call upon Mahalia to sing that song. And Mahalia was near the podium and said, Martin, tell them about the dream. Tell them about the dream. And at that time, I think that Dr. King just reached deep in his spirit and began to pull from within him the inspiration that he knew the nation needed at that time to move forward, to get beyond this sense of complacency and mediocrity when it comes to equity, and to lift them up and to lift them out and to lift them over the barriers. And so he literally pivoted his entire speech. He left the prepared remarks and he spoke from just a place, I think the same place that he was speaking from when he spoke at Garfield High School and when Dr. Gayton was in that audience. He spoke from this place of aspirational vision for America. And he told America who they can be, because he, in his spirit, he saw who we could be. We could not yet see it, but he saw it, and he communicated that vision at the right time, in the right mode, at the right place, with the right audience. And that speech literally changed, it changed America. Our policies began to change, race relations eventually began to change, but what changed most of all were people's hearts and minds, individually. That's where the change began, and people began to then see the America that we could be.
This is a powerful moment because you can see it in video and audio of the speech. There's a point at which he moves the speech aside, he takes hold of the podium, and he looks up, and he begins to give the speech that we've come to know as I Have a Dream. But that wasn't the title of the speech. Thank you, LaNesha.
Yeah, you would know, LaNesha, but one of the things that was reflected when he was there at Garfield, the title of his speech was the American Dream. But what you're saying is Mahalia Jackson, said you have, in essence, saying, you've talked about this at this point, but bring it back.
Yes,
bring it
absolutely.
back again.
Because he had been speaking, of course, all over the country. Dr. King had been speaking all over the country, giving tidbits about this dream. Even in Detroit, when he spoke in Detroit in June of 1963, he was speaking about this dream. He was beginning to, all over the country, just plant these seeds in communities around the country, trying to help Americans to see who they can be, how they can become better than what they are, by sharing his glimpses from this dream. And so Mahalia Jackson had heard his speech about the dream, had heard these references, and she just wanted him to really tell it like he had been telling it in other places, and to step away from script and to speak from spirit.
Got a couple of questions I'm going to draw from, just as you are doing, LaNesha. I understand the intent of this question. I'm just going to read it as it is. Did any NAM supporters, younger ones, question why to celebrate the 60th anniversary? And the next question we can connect, what's next for after the 60th anniversary? But did any young people question, I'm going to add a little context here. When I visited South Africa some years ago, there were young people who kind of didn't know who Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, it's a younger population. So I think the intent of this question is, did you have any young NAM supporters who didn't understand why celebrate King?
Ed, we were really inspired by the young people who participated in our MLK. We had young people on our planning committee as well, and they shared insights and ideas. They helped us with our social media planning, and they really saw the importance and the relevance of Dr. King's visit and commemorating that. We had high school students in various audiences, and the Black Graduate Student Union of the University of Washington came in full force to meet Martin Luther King III. We have a beautiful picture of the UW Black Graduate Student Association smiling from ear to ear, posed with Mr. King. And so I think that the young people of this community really embraced this opportunity to be a part of this once in a lifetime. And this really is once in a lifetime. We have elders who are with us now who were here in 1961, who literally dined with Dr. King. We interviewed Mrs. Josephine Stokes, one of the first African-American teachers in Seattle. She and her husband, Judge Charles Stokes, took Dr. King to dinner when Dr. King was here, and Mrs. Stokes shared that story. Mrs. Stokes is a beloved elder, and we have this moment with her to hear those stories. We have interviewed Dr. Gayton and many others who literally were in the presence of Dr. King. And I think that our young people realize that they are this is a special moment, because in a few years, we don't know how many of our elders will still be with us who were here in 1961, who have those living memories and those living experiences of being in the same space and place with such a historical figure. And so this is a moment to cherish, and I think our young people realized that.
If you have other questions, please send them up. I have a quote. I'm going to tell you I want to ask you who said this. You both should know this. When the power of love overcomes the love of power. Who said that?
Jimi Hendrix.
Jimi Hendrix, because Martin Luther King quoted that the other day.
Yes, he did.
He had to be ashamed to die before you've won some victory for humanity. Who said that?
He said that. He said
Who
that
said
quote. Martin King III did say that quote.
He did say that. Be ashamed to die before you've won some victory for humanity. He said that his mother had gone to school at Antioch, and that's it's inscribed there, Horace Mann. Horace Mann.
Yes.
Yep.
You mentioned Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix, he left school that year before.
Is he a Garfield student also?
Jimi Hendrix?
Yeah.
He certainly was.
You see the look I just got? He certainly was.
Yeah. And my mother's family lived next door to his family, his grandparents in Vancouver, British Columbia in the 1920s. So I'm in a close connection with the Jimi Hendrix family.
LaNesha, and again, I want to welcome other questions. You said something a moment ago that museums can't be neutral. What did you mean by that?
Well, one of the other civil rights leaders of Dr. King's era, Ella Baker, once said, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until the killing of black men and black mothers' sons is as important as the killing of white men and white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest." And that is such a profound statement. It became a song by a group, Sweet Honey in the Rock. And I believe that that's a part of the mission of Black museums. We museums who believe in freedom, we cannot rest until it comes. And so Black museums are on a mission to truly advance justice and equity until it becomes real. Our educational programs cannot rest. Our community engagement cannot rest. Our outreach, our partnerships cannot rest. The ways that our exhibitions educate and inspire and move people and show both critique and challenge and criticism, our work must not rest as museums, as educational institutions, until freedom, equity, and justice comes. And so museums cannot become neutral. There's too much hurt, there's too much pain, there's too much inequity, there's too much work to do in our communities for museums to not be on the front lines of helping to bring about change in the ways that we can. We are educational institutions, we're cultural institutions, we're arts institutions, and we're going to use what we have and do what we can to bring about a more beloved community.
Which leads
I just want to tell you about an experience that I had that relates exactly into what LaNesha is talking about. I'd given a speech, I think, at the Chamber of Commerce at the University of Washington back a couple of years ago. And I was talking about what my great-grandfather had witnessed and what he had experienced in terms of slavery, that brutality of what he witnessed and what happened to him, personally. And there's some educational entities say, well, we can't get into that. That's too bad and too difficult, to take, within a school environment. But the question that I guess I'm raising is, well, at what point do you start bringing in? They got to know about what has happened in this country and what's been embedded in our country. I had given this presentation at the Chamber of Commerce at the University District, and this lady afterwards, she came up to me and grabbed me and was sobbing, and she says, I'm so sorry that my ancestors owned slaves. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what taken place. And tears were streaming down her face, and it reminded me of what James Baldwin said, that, and I related to her, said, you're not responsible for the past. You're not responsible for the past. And he says, I'm not responsible, to the past, but we are responsible for the future. What are you going to do in the future? And people say, well, his slavery, took place. It got, why do we have to keep, dealing with that? And then you go, I forget the writer indicated the past is not dead. It's not even past. What happened beginning in 1619 and what continued on in the Jim Crow era, that went on for years, many more years than we've been a nation. Many more years than we've been a nation. And to say that that's not incorporated, bad, good things incorporated within our mindsets with regard to where this country is going. And we have to deal with that. We're talking about a long range. We can't have these immediate solutions. We have to do, when you see wrong, you begin to take care of it. But the thing is, the kind of systemic racism that we have within this country, we need to be talking about what Martin Luther King talked about, right before he got killed. And he and Malcolm X were coming together. He says, we need a Marshall Plan for this country that relates to all aspects of this country when it comes to the racism, the remembering what happened with regard to slavery within this country. We have to begin to deal with that on a massive scale. It's going to take time, but when we see these issues that we need to take care of immediately, we need to, but at the same time, we need to deal with it in a systemic way that's going to take some time.
I have a question here. And we've just got a minute or two, and so I want you to. I'm going to read the question, and I'm going to add a little something to it. So it's easy to see the issues, Carver. This is an extension of what you said: economic and social injustice, echoing from the 1960s to today.
Right.
That's exactly what you were saying. Where do you look for Dr. King's echo today? I'm going to frame this a little bit differently, LaNesha. I'm going to pick up where you left off. As concise as you can. In the context of the community that we're in now, Southeast Seattle, Othello, Seattle, King County, what does a beloved community look like now? Just describe, give us a picture of, and maybe even one-word descriptions. What constitutes a beloved community here?
I would go ahead, Carver.
Well, it reminds me somewhat of what Martin Luther King said, about the whole business of integration, and one thing that he points out, we need integration with power. Integration with not just having busing and all that sort of business and bringing people together. We need to be able to have power along with the integration. With regard to my feeling with regard to so much of this relates to what are the things that are going to be able to encourage us within ourselves that are going to make the community as a whole better off. We aren't going to be able to deal with these things unless we're able to come together, blacks and whites, together. But one thing Martin Luther King said when it came to that kind of thing, he says, I don't want to be your brother-in-law. I want to be your brother. When it comes to that sort of thing, I'm concerned about the laws and the policies that are going to be able to change and bringing down the structural racism that we have, and hopefully the love will come along with it when people start beginning to understand that all of us are benefiting from that sort of thing. And so obviously the ultimate is to be able to love, but at the same time though we can't just say that let's hug together. We need to be able to make some fundamental changes within the society, and if love comes along with it, I think that's great.
Mm-hmm. Laws and policy. LaNesha, what does a beloved community look like?
Very briefly, it is all people being fully engaged, experiencing full equity, and being fully empowered. And so full engagement, meaning that people are connected one to another. There is no sense of isolation. There is no sense of suffering alone, that we are all sharing prosperity and sharing full access to all things in the community. And equity is we all have what we need. And empowerment is that sense of being able to be true to yourself, that sense of being empowered to be.
That's right.
And to have it all rooted in love. All of this rooted in love. That is what the beloved community is all about. And that's what we're on the path to becoming here.
Carver, you've been quoting W.B. Du Bois all day, and so I'll end with a quote from Du Bois. He said, "Here is the chance for young men and women of devotion to lift up the banner of humanity and march toward a civilization that is free, intelligent, that is healthy and unafraid." I want to thank you both for engaging and leading our community in such a way that we can be closer to being free and intelligent and being healthy and unafraid. I can see why you call each other saviors and saints. Can we please give an applause to
Thank you, Chairman.